Chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 27. You have not sinned. Another argument for the permissibility of remarriage after divorce from the permissive view teachers is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 27 and 28, which says, quote, Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. End quote. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 27 and 28. They say that the following line applies to divorced people. Quote, Are you released from a wife? Divorced. Do not seek a wife. But if you marry or remarry, you have not sinned. End quote. A good example of the way this is taught by permissive view teachers can be seen from this sermon excerpt from Skip Heitzig. Quote, Are you bound to a wife? That is, are you married in the bonds of matrimony? Do not seek to be loosed. Don't try to get out of it. If you are loosed, are you loosed from a wife? Don't seek a wife. But now watch this. Even if you do marry, who's he writing to? People who are loose from their wives or husbands. They're divorced. If you do marry, you have not sinned. End quote. If Paul is speaking to divorced people here, then it would indeed mean that it would not be sinful for them to marry again. But as we will see, the context does not support that interpretation. It's specifically about unmarried people, virgins. The problem for the permissive view teachers here is that Paul is not speaking to divorced people at all. He is speaking to virgins, that is, people who have not yet been married but might be engaged to be married. Just 2 verses earlier, Paul makes it clear that this is who this section is concerning. Quote, Now concerning virgins I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. End quote. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. The Greek word virgins means the same thing as it does in English, a person who has not had sex, and here it is used as a way to say, quote, to those that have never been married. End quote. But among this group of virgins, there would also be people who were engaged or betrothed to be married. The question that Paul was addressing here when he says, quote, Are you bound to a wife? End quote, was how to handle couples who were already betrothed or had arranged marriages. Note also that the Greek word for wife just means woman. In these verses, Paul praises the single life and again tells them that it would be better if they could remain single because of the present distress. But he clarifies that these couples are not sinning if they proceed with marriage. The entire section flows naturally as a discussion directed toward these courting couples. This is so clear that even staunch permissive view teachers like John MacArthur and David Gusick don't claim that this verse supports remarriage, but instead talk about the instructions for the unmarried or betrothed. John Piper points out that the same point made in verses 27 and 28 is essentially reiterated in verse 36. He explains that verse 36 clearly refers to a couple that is not yet married, reinforcing that Paul is addressing those who have not been married before. Quote, Verse 36 is surely describing the same situation in view in verses 27 and 28, but clearly refers to a couple that is not yet married. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his virgin, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. This is the same as verse 28, where Paul says, But if you marry, you do not sin. End quote. Paul consistently tells those who have never been married that it would be better for them to remain unmarried, but if they are unable or unwilling to remain single, then they have not sinned if they do marry. That is what is happening here as well. This passage, therefore, has no relevance to the question of remarriage after divorce. Contradiction. If verses 27 and 28 are essentially saying, If you are divorced, you have not sinned if you remarry, as many permissive view teachers say, then how do they reconcile that view with Paul, who earlier in the chapter said the Lord said that a divorced person must remain unmarried or be reconciled to the original spouse? Quote, But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife." End quote. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. The obvious contradiction created by teaching that this section about virgins applies to divorced people has been pointed out by others. Quote, "A flat statement that it is not sin for divorced people to be remarried," verse 28, would contradict verse 10, where he said that a woman who is separated from her husband should remain single. End quote. John Piper. Quote, "If the situations are the same, Paul's advice in verse 28 would contradict the Lord's command earlier in verses 10 and 11 at several points." End quote. A. Andrew Doss. Loosed from a wife. Some permissive view teachers say that the word loosed in verses 27 and 28 is to be understood as divorced, but this is not what the word means in Greek, either in the Bible or elsewhere in the ancient world. This is how A. Andrew Doss explains it. Neither the noun loosening nor the verb to loose is attested in antiquity for divorce. Such words represent well-attested contractual language used to describe discharge from a bond, debt, or contract. Indeed, Aulus Gellius describes betrothal as a contract. On breaking off the betrothal to a virgin, one need only consider Joseph pondering breaking off his betrothal to Mary in Matthew chapter 1 verses 19 and 20 and 24. Many have therefore concluded that much of verses 25 through 38 is in reference to betrothed women and their fiancés. By using contractual language here, Paul is saying, are you bound or under contractual obligations to a woman? Do not seek to be free of those obligations. Are you free of such obligations from a woman? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you do not sin, and if a virgin marries, she does not sin. Paul is primarily concerned here with those who are contracted or betrothed to be married. End quote. Conclusion. The permissive view's interpretation of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 27 and 28, suggesting that remarriage after divorce is not sinful, does not hold up under closer examination of the text and context. Paul's instructions in these verses are specifically directed to those who have never been married, virgins, particularly those who are engaged or betrothed, rather than to divorced individuals. This becomes evident when considering the surrounding verses and Paul's earlier instructions, where he clearly states that divorced individuals should either remain unmarried or reconcile with their original spouse. Furthermore, the Greek terminology used in this passage supports the interpretation that Paul is referring to contractual obligations of engagement, not divorce. Additionally, the permissive view's argument that these verses permit remarriage after divorce creates a contradiction with Paul's explicit teachings earlier in the chapter and fails to align with the broader context of his message.